Welcome to this presentation of Learning Outcomes in a nutshell. My name's Rebecca Hoy. I'm the Curriculum Design Coordinator at NCC, and I'm fortunate to be able to work with our faculty as they design their courses for student success. During this presentation, I will provide a brief overview of how to write learning outcomes. At the conclusion of the presentation, I'll provide contact information so you know how to get in touch with me with your questions. Let's begin. Sometimes as teachers, we are in love with our textbooks. We think all of the information within it is important for our students to know. I love Wiggins and McTighe's Understanding by Design, and I think everyone should read it. I think everyone should attend a conference about it. I think everyone should follow their strategy of backwards design. However, despite how much I believe in this book, and you might believe in your textbook, you are not married to your textbook. Your textbook is only a resource for what you think is most important for your students to learn in your class. You should be able to change out your textbook every year and have the learning outcomes in your course remain the same. In our process of rethinking the way we teach, we have to shift our focus from the textbook to the learning outcomes we want our students to achieve by the end of class, and use the textbook only as a tool to help get our students there. That's why it's important to think about the big picture of our course instead of thinking about what the textbook contains. In thinking about the overarching purpose and goals of our course, we have to ask ourselves, what do I want my students to know at the end of this course? In other words, what content knowledge do I think is most important for them to store in their long-term memories? What content knowledge is most essential to the topic of this class? What do I want my students to do at the end of this course? Outcomes about what we want our students to do are focused on the psychomotor skills we teach in our course. That might be how to use a piece of equipment, or how to make a weld, how to adjust a camera, how to use body language to be most effective in a speech, or anything else that involves using our body to perform a skill. Last, we ask ourselves, what do I want my students to feel at the end of this course? Outcomes about values, attitudes, and feelings are affective outcomes. I'm not insinuating we all want our students to be able to hug each other or over-emote. Affective outcomes might be that we want our students to value safety, to value customer satisfaction, to feel compassion and empathy to their patients, to appreciate diversity, or to perform their best work because it represents their employer. When we begin to think about what we feel is important for our students to know, do, and value at the end of our class, it's tempting to want to cover everything. This goes back to our textbooks. I'm not certain about you, but when I was given my first teaching job, I was so uncertain about what I was supposed to be doing that I used the textbook as a Bible. And I thought, everything within it must be taught. I started at the beginning, and I worked my way to the end, just hoping that the textbook would touch on all the learning outcomes written by someone else in the course descriptions that were handed to me. However, when we attempt to teach everything, we end up giving our students the Platte River. I'm uncertain of whether you're familiar with the Platte that runs through Nebraska, but the joke is that the Platte River is an inch deep and a mile wide. When we attempt to teach the entire textbook, or all of the information we feel is important, we run the risk of giving our students the Platte. We cover a lot of content, but we don't cover it deeply enough for them to really understand it with any great sophistication. When they leave our class, they will have memorized an extensive number of facts that will quickly be forgotten. When we shift our thinking to learning outcomes, we shift to covering a more limited number of concepts, but we begin to cover them more deeply. We have the opportunity to move beyond the lowest levels of learning to higher order thinking. Those limited concepts, the ones we feel are most important in our course, become the pillars that hold up the curriculum. They are the general instructional objectives, or GIOs. The GIOs are the big pieces of content, the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective outcomes we feel are most important for our students to understand at a deep level. Remember, our students are digital natives. If we help them understand the big pieces, they can whip out their smartphone at any time to look up facts and figures. Information is always right at their fingertips, so we can stop taking their mental energy on memorizing the trivial and focus on what it is we want them to know, do, and value at the end of our course. While there's no set number of required GIOs, generally we aim for about 4 to 7. That's not to say you could not have 3 or 9, but if you find yourself While there's no set number of required GIOs, generally we aim for about 4 to 7. That's not to say you couldn't have 3 or 9, but if you find yourself with 20 GIOs, then you might be attempting to cover the Platte River with your students. When we write our GIOs, we want to keep in mind that our outcomes should be specific, measurable, and student-centered. You might hear the phrase student-centered often lately. It's become a catchphrase in education. However, it's very important to keep in mind when you're writing learning outcomes, because we're shifting our focus away from what we are going to do as a teacher to what we want our students to do. This is somewhat of a if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around, doesn't make a sound scenario. If a teacher teaches, does that mean the students are learning? It does not. I could lecture for 15 hours on Wiggins and McTighe's backwards design, but that doesn't necessarily mean my students will learn it. Our focus must be on what we want our students to know, do, and feel at the end of our class, not what we are going to do during class to get them there. Here's an example. Often when I review old learning outcomes, I see ones like this. Discuss the impact that the westward migration of American settlers had on Native Americans. The teacher who wrote that wasn't thinking about what she wanted her students to do, because when she assessed the concept, it's very unlikely she would ask her students to discuss. She would ask her students to describe it in a short answer question, or even to answer some multiple choice questions about it. What the outcome was really about was what the teacher was going to do. The teacher was going to discuss it, or lead a class discussion about it. But at the end of class, what does the teacher want her students to know, do, or value about the concept of migration in the United States? This outcome doesn't say. That's why it's so important when writing outcomes to start with a verb that describes what kind of evidence you want your students to give you at the end of class to show you they've achieved the learning outcome. If you really want your students to be able to discuss a concept, then you have to ask them to provide you evidence that they can, by assigning them to lead a small group discussion, or by giving a presentation, or by participating in a debate. However, if you don't intend to ask your student to provide evidence that they can discuss the topic, then choose a different verb. Do you want your students to describe it, explain it, identify ways migration of settlers impacted Native Americans? Those verbs, describe, explain, identify, are the ones you would choose, because they tell the student how you expect them to give you evidence that they've achieved the learning outcome. You can see that your outcomes are closely aligned with your assessment. In fact, the verb in the outcome tells the student how they're going to be assessed. If you want the student to describe something, likely they will be assessed with a short answer question. If you want the student to troubleshoot a mechanical problem, the verb troubleshoot indicates to students that they're going to have to provide evidence that they can troubleshoot an actual mechanical problem in an assessment. This is why vague words like understand or comprehend are not good verbs for learning outcomes. How do you assess understand? It isn't specific, measurable, or student-centered. When you have identified around 4 to 7 general instructional objectives for your course, then you can break down those big pillars into smaller pieces. The smaller pieces are called Specific Learning Outcomes, or SLOs. The SLOs are the smaller pieces of knowledge, or the smaller skills necessary to provide evidence that the student has achieved the GIO. For example, a GIO might be that you want your students to be able to explain how the circulatory system functions in the human body. In order for students to achieve that GIO, they have to know the parts of the circulatory system, how each functions, what each is responsible for, and how the parts of the circulatory system are connected. When your students can do the smaller SLOs, it provides evidence that they've met the larger GIOs. Let me show you another example. Here are my GIOs for this presentation. I want you to be able to write learning outcomes using SLOs and GIOs. When you've identified around 4 to 7 general instructional objectives for your course, you can then break down those big pillars into smaller pieces. The smaller pieces are called Specific Learning Outcomes, or SLOs. The SLOs are the smaller pieces of knowledge, or the smaller skills necessary to provide evidence that the students achieved the bigger GIO. For example, a GIO might be that you want your students to be able to explain how the circulatory system functions in the human body. In order for your students to achieve that big GIO, they will have to know the parts of the circulatory system, how each functions, what each is responsible for, and how it's connected to the circulatory system as a whole. When your students can do the smaller SLOs, it provides evidence that they've met the larger GIO. Let me show you an example. Here are my GIOs and SLOs for this presentation. I have 2 GIOs indicated. The first is that by the end of this presentation, I want you to be able to write learning outcomes using GIOs and SLOs. The second outcome I want you to achieve is to be able to align learning outcomes with assessment. Notice that there are 6 SLOs under that first GIO. Look at the verbs. Each of these is what you as my students will do, not what I will do as the teacher. As well, I could assess you on each of these because they are specific and measurable. Notice that your outcomes all feed up. Your SLOs feed up to your GIOs. Your GIOs feed up to your program outcomes. If an accreditor examined your program, you should be able to show them how your students are achieving the program outcomes by identifying the GIOs that fit with each program outcome from the classes in the program. Last, the program outcomes feed up to the mission of the college. While this presentation was brief, understanding how to determine and then write learning outcomes can actually be more challenging than it sounds. If you have questions, I hope you'll let me know. Please feel free to contact me at rhoey@nwicc.edu or give me a call at extension 190 to set up an appointment or simply to visit through email or on the phone. I'd be happy to work with you.